Now, live on tape from the Netflix Theater in Los Gatos, California, it's the Netflix Globalization team.
Well, we're Netflix, so we have to start with a little video clip, right?
Storia può giungere da qualsiasi luogo.
Von den geheimnisvollen Wäldern Deutschlands
İstanbul'un tarihi sokaklarına.
Puede ser en cualquier idioma y en cualquier época.
Może wpłynąć na nasze postrzeganie przeszłości i kazać nam pytać o przyszłość.
Sie kann uns fesseln.
Una buena historia nos inspira a ser quienes somos.
Cela nous rappelle qu'il faut aimer et rire.
Man kæmpe for det, vi tror på.
History was not made by those who did nothing.
Las historias tienen el poder de recordarnos que somos más similares que diferentes.
Right, now, come on. It's not about the language. It's about the spirit.
Great stories unite us.
Everything happens for a reason.
J'ai envie de croire en ce que je peux faire.
Hello, welcome. Welcome to Netflix. I see some familiar faces, some new ones. If you have been here before, welcome back. If you're new, welcome. My name is Kathy Rockney. I'm Director of Globalization. My team and I are responsible for making Netflix available in the many different languages of the world. So far, it's been 27 languages. We are part of a larger organization called Creative Production that reports into our Chief Product Officer. So we are part of the product organization. The members of this organization come from different backgrounds and different languages, representing the diversity of our global members around the world. We collectively speak, wait a minute. We collectively speak 36 languages, although for this crowd, that's nothing. And we have the experience of living in 67 countries. Close to half of our members speak at least 2 languages. So we, as you see here, we take our global perspective and global responsibility quite seriously. And we apply it to everything that we do. This global perspective has granted us close to 150 million members around the world. If you were here 2 years ago, this number was just 100 million. So in 2 years, we added a couple more languages, a lot more global content, original content, and we therefore added our membership. So by way of recap, in 2011, we started localizing our service in French Canadian. Right after that, we did Latam Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese. In 2016, we became a global service. Not necessarily in all the languages. We still have a lot of languages to cover. But everywhere around the world, with the exception of a couple of countries, were able to actually access Netflix no matter where they were. So what we've learned in this couple of years is that our members love great stories. It doesn't matter what language they come in. We actually have seen an increased consumption of a second language asset. By that, we mean dubbed audio or subtitles. These stories that come from around the world have one thing in common. They're about human emotions. They represent human stories. These stories, these human emotions are universal, and as such, they appeal to a global audience. All we need to do is to highlight those emotional moments in an authentic and meaningful way so that our members can find the story that they love so that they can watch it in any language. So Again, if you've joined us 2 years ago, you kind of went through, or we took you through the journey of localizing our service. You saw how we localize our UI, how we localize our titles. Tonight, we're going to take you through the journey of subtitling. Our team will come in a minute and start talking about kind of what goes behind the scene so that you can actually enjoy the title, the content that you like, no matter what language they're coming. So I want to invite Sue, and she's going to start the journey for you.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Sue Bolton, and I am the Globalization PM Manager for the Content Group located in Los Angeles. It's that group that's responsible for the subtitle workflow. And tonight, I'm going to walk you through the subtitle story from its very early beginnings to where we are now and what we do at Netflix. So, back in 1903, Edwin Porter, utilizing Thomas Edison's technology, built the first movie using something called intertitles. Intertitles were painted and drawn, and they were inserted between 30-second sequences of silent film, talking to what was going to happen in that film. Now, back then, this was a full feature-length film. It was 14 minutes long. Now, we've come a long way since then.
You never know when you'll find someone who'll change your life.
Aww. Aya. Hello, you beautiful baby corp.
How's work, Sonny?
I make sure the world loves babies more than puppies.
Come here. Hey, is your name afraid to come to buddy? A trash can? Our parents were part of something. You made a choice to join a family. Hi, Mommy. You're the best mommy of all the mommies in all the world.
We have eyes everywhere, and we are always watching.
Does this seem like a nightmare? Because that's the effect I was going for.
I'm gonna bag the tiger.
This episode is about to get much, much worse.
What if we named him Michael Jordan? That's the dumbest name for a dog I've ever heard.
So you might ask, what is a subtitle? And you might have noticed the Greek at the bottom of the scene. A subtitle is the text that translates the dialogue or the narrative that's going on the scene. And you might see it at the bottom or in various other positions depending on what's going on, how much we have to translate, or even creative intent. Now, at Netflix, localization is a post-production activity, but we are working upstream with our production teams and with our content acquisitions teams to really partner with them and to deliver a great multilingual experience. Now, that multilingual experience all starts with the script. The script for us is context. Now, in entertainment, we also use other types of context: director's input, dialogue lists, the script, showrunners, and even storyboards. Now, we're going to look deeper into the subtitle workflow so you can get an inside view of what's going on. And I'm going to hand you over to Ivan.
Thank you, Sue. So my name is Ivan Buchanan. I'm a program manager in the content localization team, also located in LA. So we use the context that Sue was just talking about to better deliver on our goal, which is to preserve creative intent within our localized content. So this allows us to create a situation for audiences around the world and enable them to share equally on the intended experience. Now, we deliver these experiences to users globally through these 3 time text assets. So let's take a very quick look at each of them. So we use subtitles to deliver users a localized experience in a text form. So as I mentioned before, we preserve creative intent, but also we create a written experience that can be comfortably consumed and understood by our users around the world. Second asset is SDH. SDH is also known as closed captions, and they are created for the hearing impaired. SDH uses name and sound effect identifiers to allow the hearing impaired to experience what is going on screen. Last but not least, we have forced narratives, and forced narratives are simply text overlays that are important to the story and are not covered in the audio. Forced narratives can communicate things such as the location of a scene or show, details about a person talking to a camera in a documentary, or dialogue lines in the primary language in a film. Now, these three assets are created from an English template, which is a source document you don't see from the user perspective. An English template is a full subtitle file that covers all plot-pertinent dialogue and on-screen text. The template is used by the translators as a guide, and it follows our time text style guide specs. You'll get to actually see an example of an English template throughout the presentation. Now I'll pass it on to Eva, who'll talk to you about our tools.
Hi everyone, my name is Eva Ramondi. I'm a project manager also based in LA, working on subtitles. I'm going to walk you through a little bit about how we're creating these assets. We required a means to scale up for our full slate of originals and create assets that go from production into launch seamlessly. The ultimate goal, again, taking creative intent global. So we created our own proprietary tool called the Originator. The Originator tool is a centralized hub for a number of users, project managers, vendors, and translators, all to serve their own unique needs, whether that includes monitoring and tracking, training, billing, handling performance, or creating AV translations from scratch. First and foremost, it is a tool to create AV translations from scratch. This is what the linguist experience looks like. In the top left, they have access to the video and all the associated toggles. In the bottom is an interactive waveform, complete with shot change generated automatically off of the video. The right side shows where they translate, with that left side English template showing any annotations that the template creator has provided for the translator. They work in the right column, and we're able to automatically generate notifications based on our standards, such as this one, which shows a character per line limit. In the bottom, in the next event, we're able to surface the reading speed, and the linguist is then able, the translator is able to extend and modify it in the waveform. In providing these, we're able to allow translators to self-serve and troubleshoot and identify different pitfalls in subtitling. One of the most critical aspects is that we're also able to surface context in real time. So as production provides scripts or different teams provide show guides, we can surface that directly to the linguist. They're able to search related episodes, so if they've completed something, they can check back and make sure they're keeping their translation consistent, even though they may have delivered it to us. Another critical aspect for all users, admins and translators alike, is the scheduling system. Initially, we were sending out email blasts, trying to make sure we could get people to work on the projects, and we came up with SAS. It's our automated scheduling system. As assets become available to work on, they'll surface with the timeline we need. Linguists can come in and self-serve and have a shopping experience that surfaces synopsis, artwork, source and target languages, and anything else they might need to know, such as scheduling information. In case something hangs out in SAS for a long time, say no linguist has picked it up, we do have an admin workspace to bubble up anything that we need to monitor. So it's exception-based. Stuff that's flowing through will drop to the bottom, but we can easily see unassigned, critical, or overdue tasks. So you may have noticed in that initial shot of the tool, we take a lot of care to provide clear shot change indicators and really modifiable events within the waveform. And that's because there are some very particular considerations to take into account for subtitling. We're not just worrying about space that it may take up, but also the time it may take up. That's where different considerations come in, such as reading speed. Reading speed is how long we expect someone to be able to read the subtitle, or to read the subtitle. It may differ for adults and kids, and we can set those indicators in the tool, as you saw, to help translators work around what the expected audience would want. If they want to, for example, create a nice, easy reading speed, they might extend the out time of a subtitle event, but then you might run into other issues. Timing to audio. If a subtitle is not timed to within a few frames of the audio, the audience might feel a little bit distracted or irritated that something's lingering on screen for too long, or they might even feel like they've missed something. That's where accuracy and truncation come in. We want to stay true to source and provide the most accurate translation possible. But part of AV translation is identifying where that balance needs to happen and truncating in smart ways to make sure it provides a seamless experience. We don't want someone feeling like they're reading subtitles and watching content. We want it to be sort of a whole experience. So I'm going to provide an example, explained season 1. This video goes really, really fast, so be ready.
It used to be convicts, carny, bikers, and sailors. Since the days of primitive man, tattoos have...
Did you catch that? I barely did. So the man says, it used to be convicts, carnies, bikers, and sailors. And right after that, you have a shot change and more audio. And in fact, the dialogue of that first line kind of goes over the shot change, which doesn't leave much room for the translator. So let's take a look again and try to see what the Spanish translator did.
It used to be convicts, carny, bikers, and sailors. Since the days of primitive man, tattoos have...
It's still pretty quick, but if you got to catch it, they cut out the word carnies. You're still able to convey the people that that sentence is talking about, get the feeling across, but make it at least a little bit more digestible in a really complicated situation. Now we'll bring up Melissa Sakamoto to talk about some of the international challenges we face.
Hi everyone, my name is Melissa Sakamoto. I'm a project manager based here in Los Gatos, and I'm going to talk through some of the challenges that we face every day at Netflix internally. So the first challenge I'm going to talk through is understanding international content. So as we mentioned earlier, we are seeing a growing appetite for international content, no matter what the language is. So for us at Netflix, we also have to understand what that content means. Even if, for example, that show is in Swedish, like Quicksand, or in French, like Plancourt. Plancourt. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I tried. Or Spanish, like Elite, or Korean, like My First Love, or Turkish for The Protector. The list of languages can go on and on and on. And the reason that poses a challenge for us internally is because our cross-functional teams might not have an individual who understands the original source language of that content. So we've had to identify a way to figure out how we can take all of this international content, no matter what language it comes in, and make it understood internally at Netflix. So the way we've addressed that challenge is to get an early version of the show and subtitle it in English. And English here at Netflix is the common language that everybody understands and everybody speaks. And just by implementing this one step, we're now able to enable multiple cross-functional teams to do their work. So for example, the marketing team, they can understand the content, and now they can figure out the type of campaigns that they want to put behind that title. Another example is publicity. They can understand the content and figure out what kind of decisions they want to make well in advance before the launch. Another example is the dubbing team. They can understand the characters and try to figure out what kind of voice actors or talent actors they want to work with. And then finally, for globalization, for our team, we're working very, very early upstream, getting these lock cuts. And that means that we have context when we do our downstream work for translations. So another challenge. Our goal at Netflix in subtitling is to preserve the creative intent and the linguistic nuances of the original language of the show. So as Yvonne mentioned earlier, oftentimes we translate with English as a pivot language or from an English template in subtitling. However, when we do that, it's not always the best option to achieve our goal here at Netflix. What we do to achieve our goal actually is we actually remove English as a pivot language. So these are just a few examples of some language pairs. They might be linguistically similar, they might be culturally similar, or they might have a wide pool of resources who are bilingual because they're neighboring countries. So I want to provide an example here, and I want to talk specifically about APAC. So APAC linguists often have to create a relationship map to understand who is more senior, who is more elder, who is younger. And the reason they have to do that is because they're trying to figure out how to address or interact with the person they're talking to. Now take, for example, if you're trying to translate from Japanese to Korean with English as a pivot language, it's actually very difficult to keep those creative and linguistic nuances of the Japanese source. So now I have a question for you, and that is, how many of you are fans of Terrace House? Yes, very good. I highly recommend that show if you haven't watched it. So for those of you who aren't too familiar with Terrace House is a reality series where 6 strangers come together and they live in one house for the first time in Japan. And what's really interesting about this show is when they first come together and they meet each other, they're really awkward, they're super uncomfortable, and they're trying to get to know each other. And if you listen very closely, the type of Japanese that they're using is very formal, it's very distant, almost professional. And then over time, as the story develops, you'll start to notice that they change their way of speaking. They change their language that they're using. They become more friendlier. They become just more friendlier. So now if we take a step back and we think about our example of translating from Japanese to Korean with English as a pivot language, you start off with Japanese, a language that already has these embedded levels of politeness and respect and formality. And then you translate into English. And English is not able to preserve those same linguistic nuances as Japanese. And then now, you're starting from English, and you're trying to translate into Korean. But that English source has already lost its linguistic nuances. It's not preserved from Japanese. So we're creating a layer of distortion now. And then you start from English, trying to go into Korean, and Korean also has those similar levels of embedded levels of formality and respect and politeness. So when you translate from Japanese to English to Korean, you're just creating these levels of distortion. And so why not just translate directly from Japanese to Korean? So ultimately, again, our goal with subtitling is to preserve the creative intent and linguistic nuances of the original language. And the way we go about that here is by removing English as a pivot language whenever that makes sense. So now I will turn you over to Paolo, who will talk more about the challenges of cultural sensitivities.
Hello, my name is Paolo, and I'm language manager here in Los Gatos for Italian and Greek. So talking about cultural sensitivities, that's another challenge, of course, when any time to read this. This is from one of our shows, Super Drags, that did pose some challenges. How do we deal with offensive language? There might be different levels of sensitivity in different countries, right, when it comes to offensive language. And you're forewarned, and I do apologize in advance. There will be some offensive language on, so sorry about that, but we're doing it for a cause here to try and explain how we address the situations that might arise. This is, again, from Super Drags, and you can see that a lot of offensive language there. And that V word in particular, it's the equivalent of saying little f as a homophobic slur in English. Now, this might be acceptable in Brazil in the context of depicting actually a situation where somebody is using offensive language. People are perceiving it as offensive, but it is still acceptable to put it on screen, to actually have that said. And in the US, as you know, it's not acceptable to use the F word, so this is what it turns out to be once it's subtitled in the US. So we work with our vendors to create guidelines to take into account the levels of cultural sensitivity across different countries and different cultures. And this is ever evolving. We try to learn as we go more and more to be more aware of what is going on in different countries. These are things that change all the time. This is an example from an Italian show called Suburra. Some of you might have watched. As you can see, they're using the N-word. In Italy, it's considered offensive. It's become more so in the last 20 or 30 years, also because of the influence of American culture. However, it's still in use. Again, it's perceived as offensive language. In the US, you couldn't use it, so it was actually transformed. It's still very offensive, but we're not using the N-word. So what we're doing here is, again, trying to really respect the creative intent and at the same time respect the cultural sensitivities of our viewers. And so if we had translated literally the F or the N word, we would have created an impact in the US that would have been completely disproportionate to the impressions that our viewers in Brazil or Italy have garnered from watching this content. Now, moving on to another aspect of subtitling, or in this case, forced narratives. In some content might contain different languages, and we want to make sure that everybody in the world perceives the content in the same way. As an example, this is, again, from Suburra, a scene where the dialogue is in Sinti, one of the Romani languages, and that's not intelligible to Italians. So, of course, it is subtitles, but it's actually a forced narrative, like Ivan described before, that calls out that this is a different language. Obvious to an Italian viewer, but it would not be obvious to an English viewer, right, who's watching it with dubs or with English subs, so we need to call it out. So this is a fairly easy challenge to resolve. Sometimes challenges with multiple languages or dialects become a little more complex. As an example, with Luke Cage in season 2, we had some scenes where some of the characters were using the Jamaican patois. And the decision was made to actually subtitle that into English in the SDH because it was considered hard to comprehend. However, we did not treat it the same way in the regular content. So people who actually can hear were hearing the patois, but the hearing impaired were reading a subtitle that was standardized English. And they perceived it as a missing bit, something that they were missing out on. And so there was some backlash on Twitter. And as a result, we kind of revised our strategy. And we put out a new version of it with actually a transcription of the Jamaican patois. And this also caused us to change our style guides and include a guideline about how to transcribe dialects. And of course, as I said, this will continuously evolve, and we might encounter new challenges that we can't handle in the same way, because as an example, I can think of several Italian dialects that are not very understandable for most Italians, right? And which we could not treat in this manner, and so we'd have to judge it case by case and figure out how to handle it. And now I'm going to hand over to Eva, who is going to talk to you about some visual challenges.
Hi everyone, my name is Eva Metz-Tolliver and I'm a program manager in content localization.
Mic is not on.
Your mic is on now.
Technical difficulty.
All right, so subtitling is also called audio-visual translation, with audio being the dialogue and visual being other elements in the actual video that tell the story, that tell the narrative. This could be too far, sorry. So this could be place or time identifiers like you see here, or it could be an identifier for a person speaking, which we see a lot in documentaries. We call those elements burn-ins. These are elements that are being added after shooting is completed during the post-production process.
Now, some of these might be universally understood and don't need any translation, but some may, and that also varies from language to language. However, subtitling those burn-ins can be tricky because there may not be enough time or space to actually include a translation when you also have dialogue that's happening at the same time. If we decide to translate those, and if we have the time and space, we try to differentiate between on-screen elements and dialogue by capitalizing the on-screen text and leaving the dialogue in sentence letters. So I'll have an example for you.
Bob lived in a government yard in Trenchtown when we had the troubles in the 60s.
So I don't know if you could catch that, but the speaker was identified at the top of the screen in those capital letters in the subtitle. There are other graphic elements in video that have meaning, that convey the story. And the job of an audio-visual translator is it to identify which of those are plot pertinent. Which of that text that is conveyed in this graphic is important and crucial for the viewer to understand, to really understand the story. Those are the ones that we want to subtitle. We do want to be mindful that we don't subtitle too many, because if you think about it, anytime you add a subtitle, it's inherently a little bit distracting, right? You're forcing the viewer to read now. It takes away a little bit from the story, so we want to be mindful about what we include. And that is why, for example, we would include a translation for that gravestone here and a translation for the text message, but we didn't include one for this letter down here because in the actual movie, the person who writes the letter was also speaking it out loud. It was basically reading it in his head, so it was not necessary for us to include that information in the subtitle. Now, you've heard that word forced narrative file a few times this evening. So this is a subtitle file that is played against a dubbed audio file. And whenever you have those two assets come together, there's a chance that there might be surprising interactions. I have that example for you from the show Love. So in this show, the main character, his name is Gus. He's writing his love interest. He's texting her, right? And he's writing, hey, it's Gus, sub. And there's several ways of translating this word. So he listed 3 here. I'm sure there's a bunch more. 3 for German. I'm sure there's a bunch more that you could translate that. So generally, if a subtitler would come across that, he or she would choose the best option and move on. But in this case, it turns out that Gus actually is reading out his own text a few minutes later to his friends, and that poses a whole new challenge. And I'll show you this clip now.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't know, because it's like, I think I like overplayed my hand. Dude, freaking out only makes it worse. She'll text, man. What'd you text her? I texted her like, sup? Sup? Just sup? Sup? Question mark? Sup is perfect, man. I've gotten laid texting sup plenty of times. Okay. She'll text.
So once we realized that, we coordinated with our dubbing team and with our dubbing studios to find out what they would be using in the dubbed audio files so that we could then use that exact translation in our on-screen subtitle translations. And so for German, it turned out to be that option number 3, and that is what we included here in our forced narrative subtitle. And with that, I will hand it over back to Kathy.
So you saw the magic. It's a lot of work. It's where art and science comes together. It's where creativity and scale comes together. It's the right brain and the left brain working together, right? Obviously, we do it because it makes business sense. As I mentioned at the beginning, 60% of our members come from around the world outside of the US. But we also do it because we believe every piece of content, no matter the language, the origin, or the scope, has the potential to inspire an individual somewhere in some language, or to become a global phenomenon. We believe in the power of great stories. We believe great stories can bring people together no matter the barriers, the differences, or the different languages. And we believe everyone loves a good story. So with that, and because we're Netflix and we have to start and finish with a little video clip, I'm going to show you a video of how our global members enjoy the same title around the world. Let's watch together.
Bread was like the original hype item. Like, yo, is that rye bread? Oh, shit, son. He's got pumpernickel. Who's your connect?
Are we just a couple of freaks?
Wow, you're the man.
That robot's
Why am I
hot.
attracted to this robot?
Yes! I believe we could paint a better world if we learned how to see it from as many perspectives as we possibly could.
And you were such an amazing man.
That's funny.
No, it's okay.
All right. Questions?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna run around with the mics. Do you want to help? Okay, I'll do the other one.
Okay.
And so we'll open it up for questions. Any questions?
Right here.
And just raise your hand. Okay.
Hi. I noticed that using the input from the dubbing studio was just an exception in that one case with the forced narrative. I'm wondering why that's not done more often. Like, you'd want to have the subtitles match the dubbing.
I can answer. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, here.
So that's a great question, one we get a lot. I think we would love to have them match, but as you saw, the subtitles have such different constraints. Dubbing, they're going to really want to focus on lip sync, and on subtitling, they're going to want to focus on matching that timing in the right way. So we had this choice, and while we do want to move towards making them come closer together, we don't want to provide a suboptimal experience for either one. So if we were to try to match them, odds are one kind of ends up winning out or unbalancing the other and providing a really negative experience for the viewer of one.
I think I would also add that they serve different purposes in a way. And if you think about dubbing, can have more freedom in a way because you will only consume that dubbed audio. With subtitles, the audience still understands the original. They may understand English to a certain degree, but just want to have the additional help with subtitles in some cases. So you want to be more close to the source in the subtitle, whereas in dubbing you have more freedom.
Now, needless to say, that is one of the variables we take into consideration amongst just the vastness of complexities that we run into. But again, it's a decision at the end that we need to make just for the sake of the quality of the content.
Okay, Janet?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. It was very enlightening, and we all loved all the clips.
Especially the Greek one. Right?
Especially the Greek one. Yes, thank you. We're a minority here. Thank you. So talking about these languages and the difference in the speed of talking versus the speed of reading, we have this problem. There are languages that expand considerably. And of course, in digital forms, we have a way of, dealing with them. And you have talked yourselves of how to deal with them. However, when you're talking about going up the chain in the creative process, which is what the rest of the digital companies are trying to do with written word, is there a way that you can foresee that you'll be going up on the creative process to create the equivalent of internationalization for creative, content?
I can speak to that. I think we have the advantage, Netflix has the advantage of being, or starting as a technology company and becoming an entertainment company. As such, we have a great engineering team, some of them are sitting here, who we always kind of innovate with, talk about things, and come up with new tools and workflows and processes. You just saw an example of one. So I would say never. We will continue to innovate in this area to see what we can come up. And again, our goal is to scale while kind of adhering to the creative intent. So anything in that, to that end, will be something that we will look into.
We have a question up here.
Hi, I'm a student from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, as lots of people here in the audience. And I'm going to ask a question that many probably are interested in. So I am from Translation and Interpretation program. So many of us are inspired to work for Netflix and to work in subtitling. So that's why it would be really interesting if someone of you can just talk a little bit more on how you look for your translator talent. Shut down translation portal Hermes project as well. I'm just curious to hear more. Are you planning to relaunch that? Or, yeah, thank you.
Sure. I would like to invite perhaps Allison Smith. Thank you.
Sure, I think I'm famous for talking about this topic. Pardon. Yeah, so we use a pool of vendors to help us train, test, and recruit subtitlers. So we have a list of vendors. If you're interested in working yourself, we can give you that list. The idea there was we originally created the Hermes platform trying to own the entire pipeline of getting subtitlers tested and onto our platform. And we did a little bit of introspection, I think. It must have been a little more than a year ago now, looking at what our core competencies are as a company, thinking about ourselves as a tech company moving into the entertainment space, looking at our engineering teams and the kinds of tools that we build, our distribution models, taking content and distributing it around the world, and how we can best do that. And one of the things that we discovered there was that it really was outside of our core competency to test and train these linguists, but it was well within the core competencies of a lot of the vendors that we worked with. And so we decided to take that testing, training, recruiting, and onboarding and move that into our vendors so that we could focus on the amazing tools that you saw here, these important decisions that get made along the way, the project management and that those kinds of works, and actually creating the localized assets and distributing them.
Thanks, Alison. I'm going to take another one here because I don't want to run at the other end.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I guess I have a very specific question. I'm a huge fan of On My Block. I really am. So, but I'm also a Spanish speaker. So when I watched On My Block in English, it was sprinkled with like Mexican and Mexican-American Spanish. I loved it so much, I watched the dub version, and it was in very neutral, general Spanish. So who makes the decisions? And then also the subtitling was awesome, by the way, in Spanish. I loved it. But I mean, who makes the decisions to neutralize the language when it's so seasoned in the original? And also, will there be a season 3? And can you encourage? Thank you.
So we obviously... Mic is off.
Sorry about that. All right. Obviously, anything I say, take it with a grain of salt because we learn from it. We learn from what we do, and we might change our strategy. But today, our strategy specifically for dubbing is that for the languages when there are two different versions, like Latam Spanish and Iberian Spanish, or French Canadian and European Canadian, same for UK English and US English, where we believe that our audience can understand either version, we just go with the original language. If the title is originally made in that language. Now, in terms of dubbing from a separate language to any of those languages, we usually go with one version. But again, these are some of the things that we are looking, again, one of the advantages of being a technology company and data-driven company, we look at a lot of the consumption data, and based on that, we might make a different strategic decision later on. In terms of season 3, I let our content team know about the enthusiasm.
Okay, I'm going to take another question here. Yeah, and then I'll go to the other side.
I wanted to ask a question. You have a great resource, obviously, with these 150 million people who are watching your programming. And you also mentioned that you reacted to feedback and actually changed the subtitles and things, which I think is great that you do that. So have you ever thought of marrying the two so that the users, when they're watching one of these movies and they see a subtitle that they don't like, or that offends them, or they don't understand, or they think they have a better translation, they can hit pause and then type in a little feedback, and you get that feedback and you can actually tweak that specific piece of dialogue?
That's a great idea.
Oh, great.
Yes, I think we have different ways of gathering feedback from our members. We have now a question mark. Some of you might not have seen it, but when you're watching, there's a little question mark somewhere on the screen, when you can basically click and add your feedback in there. We still haven't developed our technology such that you can input the subtitling, the correct subtitling yet, but you never know.
And can I just, one more quick question. Do you have live content like sporting programs, and what's your solution, or you don't have it?
We don't have that. News and sporting we don't have, and it's not yet part of our strategy.
Okay, thank you.
So, hey, hello everyone. So, I'm a linguist here, so I'm very interested in the tool that you're using. I believe it's called Originator tool. So I assume that the workflow would be you have one group of linguists transcribe like what you would like to be the source text, and another group of linguists would translate that source text. But do the translators have the right, for example, to change the source text? For example, they think some forced narratives are actually not necessary, or there's something wrong about the source text. How do they report? How do they, do they have the right to change the source text? Thank you.
You're asking, yes, that source text falls into the template column, as you saw. And while they can't modify the template itself, they have the freedom to change what happens in their translation column to what's best suited for the territory. There will be some places where you just may not, especially if it's covering, for example, a different language dialogue, they may not need it for their language if it's understandable for their territory. So they do have freedom to modify, and we advise people to listen to the audio and take that as the source of truth, and that's part of staying close to the creative. But otherwise, we do keep in contact as anything escalates to make sure we're getting a good source file.
Hi, also over here, if I may free write a question since I'm sitting next to her. I wonder how many linguists touches a show, which is how many linguists works on a show, and if there's a lot of people involved, how do we ensure consistency across the whole show?
We do attempt as much as possible to keep the same linguist for a language across a season. And utilize different tools to keep consistency, like other related episodes or any sort of glossaries we can provide. As with anything in the industry, there's always an edge case where someone gets sick or can't work on something, and then we do run into those problems. But our goal is to keep seasons together.
Joe, I have a question on this side.
Per season. Wow, that's a full-time job.
Do you
Thank you.
utilize machine translation and speech-to-text technology for your subtitling?
Oh, sorry, I can't see. Oh, where that's right. I think we do speech to text, right? As for at the beginning of our, at the beginning for the specifically for the English template, we do that. Machine translation. The way we look at it is that basically, if any technology can give us the creative intent that we're looking for, we will look into it. So far, that hasn't happened, but we are looking. We're investigating all sorts of basically technology.
So I have a question about the language that you're going to for each show. So I assume that you're not translating like every show into like all the 27 languages. I assume. So how would you select which language to translate for each show?
So far for our global content, a lot of things goes into basically making a title available in both in different territories and different languages. If the content is original content, meaning Netflix is basically owns the title, so far we have done it in all the languages for the majority of our titles. Now, as we grow our languages and the number of our titles, we need to definitely look at our strategy and decide whether we're going to basically look at it differently, and maybe based on some of the view data in a specific territory, we might make a different decision. These are all the strategies that, again, evolving, and we look and decide and change based on a lot of the data and based on basically the size of the catalog for each of the market.
Do you assess and or redo translations of movies that are not Netflix originals? That is, if Netflix has The Last Jedi, does Netflix evaluate how that was originally translated and make any changes?
Yeah. So yes, all the files that are being delivered to us go through a QC process, and then if we find substantial things that are not up to our standard, we will generally work with the partner that delivered those files to get those fixes done. So we are not doing them ourselves. We work with the partner who delivered the files.
Yeah, keep in mind that subtitles are considered kind of like an IP. So if the title was owned, let's say, by Disney, for example, or by some other big or small studios, we necessarily don't have the right to change those subtitles. But what we will do, depending on how disruptive that experience could be for our members, we will go back to them and give them the feedback and ask them for a redelivery, basically. But we can't change them ourselves necessarily.
Hey, hi. This is sort of a follow-up to one of the questions that was asked earlier. One thing I noticed when I was living abroad in Japan is that there would be a lot of content produced in Japan and posted online on the Japanese Netflix server that would have the Japanese subtitles, but maybe not subtitles in any of the other languages. Even though I know that when you would see something like Terrace House on the American Netflix, you would have a bunch of different language options. So those options are obviously there. How much coordination do you guys have with your abroad offices and sort of the international Netflix distributors, I guess, in order to decide where those subtitles go, how many will be produced, and is there really a reason why you might not have all of those subtitles options just because of population, language populations in those countries? Thank you.
So I guess kind of goes back to the point I was making. If the content is not Netflix content, there's licensing a lot of licensing agreement that needs to happen. That licensing agreement is for both languages, like what languages you can actually broadcast or show, and also what countries you could have them. So there's a lot of kind of decision that needs to go within kind of in that decision. And then we have also the kind of UI and how we produce or we present those options to our members depending on where they are. If you live in Japan, chances are we don't necessarily automatically provide you with the option to see French, I'm just saying. You might, but you know, so it really depends on kind of a lot of other factors depending on the language of your account setting, your IP, your previous kind of experience and whatnot. But it's a complicated, it's a very complicated decision making that has to do with a lot of caveats.
And the tip there is, if you run into situations like those, try changing the UI, and you'll get a different subset of languages offered to you.
Okay, good tip. Thank you so much.
Hello. I guess I'm here. Hi. Thank you for your presentation. It was really amazing. I guess my question was somewhat related to the last one. I noticed that although China is a huge market, it's not, Netflix is not present there. I was wondering if there's any progress being made in that regard, and if the globalization team is prepared, if the mainland China market is ready to go.
We have some geopolitical reason not to be in China at the moment, and it's really, some of the requirements might not necessarily align with some of kind of the our strategy at the moment. Although our UI and also our content is available in both Mandarin and both traditional and simplified Chinese. So in terms of preparation, if that happens, we're absolutely ready. Again, the product is available in those languages.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. This was so fun. My question is about the QA process. I really like the part where the internal tool was kind of flagging the potential issues and the linguists were able to fix it. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about the QA process. And a follow-up question was about linguistic QA, because if you guys need someone to binge watch all the shows for quality, I wanted to know.
I can speak to that. We do have a separate QA/QC process that wasn't indicated in the video. All of our text assets, all of our subtitles do go through some form of QC. We have dive linguistic QC, and then if we think we might be able to, like we know there might be an error somewhere, we can do an easier flagging QC. So that does occur on all of our assets, and we can decide based on how much we think it needs to improve.
Thank you for presentation. It's here. My question is also related to language quality. I want to know about your strategy on language quality assurance. Like, do you have any adopted metrics to evaluate your work, or do you actually have a dashboard to monitor any data that reflects language quality? Thanks.
That as a follow-up to the QC question. Through that QC process, I should have mentioned we do gather flags. We have set error codes based on what we've gathered, so we can aggregate that. Make quality.
You have a question on your side?
Oh, one of them's not shy. One.
Hi, my name is Neda. I'm a linguist in Apple, and I have a question regarding the challenges you guys facing. So you mentioned most of it was like technical, but as a cultural challenges, my question, do you guys keep the content between languages, or you have a specific policy for each language? So for example, if you have something not matching with Arab culture, let's see, for example, do you guys skip some stuff, or you just do it the same material as it is? You take it.
I'm not sure.
You have like specific policy?
Maybe I can take that.
Yeah,
I think,
sure.
So first of all, I think Paulo mentioned, and I'd love for him to kind of talk about some of the cultural nuances. But I think one thing that I want to kind of highlight is that we don't change the the content for a specific reason. We don't censor, we don't change the concept, the content. We, again, as the team mentioned, our goal is to adhere to the creative kind of integrity. So then there might be decisions, like geopolitical decisions, to not necessarily, for whatever reason, which has been extremely rare, that we don't necessarily show some episode or some content in a specific country. But again, we don't necessarily do censorship. I want to ask Paulo to perhaps talk a little bit about the cultural aspect.
Yeah, as I was mentioning during the presentation, we do try and stay abreast of developments in different countries in terms of cultural sensitivity. And so this entails working with our vendors to make sure that there are specific guidelines about, what language is suitable when dealing with certain sensitive topics that might be more sensitive than in one area than in another, right? So whether it is offensive language such as the examples that I showed, or talking about LGBTQ, or talking about disabilities. So what is the type of language that is considered acceptable in that country? So this is a level that we definitely get engaged in. Again, trying to always make sure that we try to stay close as possible to the creative intent, and trying to find the right way, the right meeting point between these two needs.
Thank you.
I have a question here.
I'm very interested in the tools that you're using. You said you use Originator and SAS. I'm wondering then what is the number of tools that you ask the vendors to use to do their job? And I'm also wondering what time will the training be for a vendor to learn the tools? Thank you.
Vendors work in the tool, they're typically doing more monitoring, so they pretty much have that centralized hub of Originator. And when the linguists are doing their work, we're trying to build a really integrated experience. We know it can be really frustrating to hop around between a different glossary and this and that, as you start getting the reference material too. So the goal is to keep it really centralized. What was the second part of your question again? The timing for learning. I think it can really depend. A lot, if you've worked with AV translation tools, I don't think it's a very aggressive learning period. We try to make it intuitive, but I can't really quantify it to a number.
Hello. Hi, my name is Marina. There was a certain response by Netflix film. We love cinema, and I think we all love Netflix. And it talked about access for people who can't always afford, letting everyone enjoy release at the same time, and giving filmmakers more ways to share art. So I hope someday when you have a response like that, you can also add, and we give the ability for people around the world to consume this content, to understand this content, because what you're doing is so powerful. And I want to congratulate you all. And Roma did wonderful things for online content. And I just want to shout out to you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I have a question here.
Hi, my name is Amra Selimovic. I'm a program manager at SDL, and I just have a quick question about the resources, the vendors that you're using in your linguist. Does Netflix have a sort of a resource profile that they request from their vendors for the linguists that you expect them to use? For example, native speaker from Japan will have the latest language. It will be basically most up to speed with the latest lingo that's used out in the streets than maybe somebody that lives outside of Japan. So I was just wondering if you guys have a sort of a resource profile that you request from your vendors in that regard.
Let me ask Meredith Wright, who actually helps manages our engagement program, to come in and help us answer.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so in terms of working with our vendors, we obviously have requirements in terms of the expectations that we have of our resources. We're working very closely with the language management team, of which Paolo is a great representative here, in terms of setting the expectations that we have of the resources who will be working on our content. So that would be in terms of what kind of profile, obviously what are their qualifications, what kind of experience they have, what kind of specialization. The goal is that the clearer our expectations are of those resources, the better our vendors will do in terms of finding the resources who will provide us with the quality of subtitles that we get. So I'm hoping I answered your question.
So we only have a few minutes left, so we're going to take a couple more questions and then that'll be it.
Hi, thank you for the great presentations. I was curious how long it takes to translate like your average episode or show, like from start to finish.
It can vary a lot. You saw all of the forced narratives called out in that presentation. I think it really depends on the level of specialization in the content. You could have a movie that's 2 hours long, but actually only has 20 minutes of dialogue because it's very ambient or something. So there isn't really a right answer.
And I think that's going to be the last question.
One more.
Yeah, I have a question about text that actually appears in the video in whatever language it's in, normally in English. A lot of the time you were saying that you put subtitles if it makes sense, but do you often actually go through in post-production and replace the physical text in the video with the translation of it? I've seen it before. I just don't know how much you guys work on that because I love it when that happens. Every single time.
So I don't know if you have watched You on Netflix.
I have.
Yeah, so we did it for that. So if you check it out in actually if you change your UI setting to another language, you might be able to see that. But so we are not doing it currently and, a regular basis, but, it's definitely something we're looking into, I would say.
So last question, for real this time.
Hi, thank you. It was a great presentation. My question is about your vendors. I was really curious, how do you select your vendors? Do you ever change your vendors? Do you do any sort of periodic quality assessment? How does that process work?
So yes, we do evaluate our vendors. Obviously, like a lot of professional companies, we're going to have quarterly business reviews. So we do evaluate our vendors on a regular basis. We are definitely going through a process of improving, and it's an iterative scenario in terms of the needs of the business are changing, in which case the needs of the kinds of vendors that we're using, the number of vendors changes. It is definitely something that we do, and it's not that we are always changing the cycle, but it's definitely what you want to do is you get a set number of vendors with which you're comfortable, ensure that they're providing you with the quality and the output and the resources, number of resources and kinds of resources who will meet your requirements. And then obviously if they're not doing what you need, then there's definitely a reselection process. So.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I just want to make sure that you kind of paid attention to those job posts that provided. As you saw, they're both in LA and LG. We have content team in 2 places. Check us at jobs at Netflix, and we would love to have you join this side of the podium maybe. Thanks for coming.